Okay, I believe I am live. If that's the case, you're seeing this. Welcome to what I am calling the first in a series of videos called Composer Notes. My friend Jonathan Sweet kind of gave me this idea to do a series of videos, kind of like I would do if I was clinicking a band. If I was, in their rehearsal and I give notes. I figure I start with my latest piece, Phase Shift. And if you guys have any questions about the piece, feel free to leave them in the comments below. DM them to me, and I'd be more than happy to answer it. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, Phase Shift is a grade 4.5, borderline 5 piece for concert band and electronics. It was commissioned by a consortium of schools led by Purdue University. So, how did this piece come about? Well, I think it was in early, like September 2019. I received a message from Dr. Jonathan Sweet at Purdue University that they had done my piece Spark. And they sent me a recording, and frankly, it was one of my favorite recordings of Spark. I liked it so much, I actually used it on one of my CDs. Anyway, so I was so far as like, hey, if you guys ever want to, collaborate on a piece or something, well, let's do something. And so we kind of started these discussions back and forth, and from that we came out with Phase Shift. So the idea with Phase Shift was he wanted a kind of a concert closer / barn burner style piece that would be essentially the spiritual successor to Spark. And that's why I kind of came up with one of the things I asked him if he would be okay with was electronics, and he's agreed to that. So, am I continuing to try to push the concert band medium forward more? I added electronics to the piece, and one of my goals was to make it optional. So I didn't want any group that did not have the capabilities of using an electronic system to be limited from playing this piece. But for the groups that did use it, it would just further enhance that process for them a lot more. So let's kind of look at the unusual ensemble layout here. And if you guys can hear me, someone leave a comment. If not, let me know. So here's the ensemble layout that is kind of required for this piece. And this isn't exactly precise, but basically the woodwinds are going to be split between two groups. You have your left woodwinds and you have your right woodwinds. And then left percussion and right percussion kind of bounce on the same side with the speakers, with the remaining brass electronics and percussions kind of going in the back. The idea with Phase Shift is that it's supposed to mark kind of like phasing. So imagine you're out if you've ever seen a really bad marching band out on the field that's super spread out and they're just phasing all over the place. My idea was to kind of take that and let's make that controlled. So that's where we had the left and right woodwinds and percussion kind of idea set up here. So you don't have to do exactly this, but just as long as the woodwinds are kind of sort of split evenly on two sides. And a key takeaway here is that some of the parts are marked with the letter M. So those parts are denoted as these are the main part you should play if there's one player for this instrument family. So for example, you don't have two bari saxes or you don't have two bass clarinets. I've kind of split balanced those a lot easier to make them so if you don't have all that, it can still sound like a well-balanced ensemble. And of course, the other equipment you need 61 MIDI keyboard, a laptop with the latest version of Ableton Live. Demo version's fine. Don't worry about buying it. And of course, a very, very loud PA system. So let's get into the music. For this piece, I'm going to be using the world premiere recording done by Dr. Jonathan Sweet in the Purdue Symphonic Band. This was recorded last September. So, as you can see here in the score, there's, we've got the layout already split between left and right woodwinds. So let's go ahead and just listen to the first 30 seconds or so, and then I'll kind of go through my thoughts on them. So That was the beginning up to about measure A. If you listen to the audio close enough, you can kind of see that there's this passing back and forth of this initial idea between the woodwind sections. And at the beginning of the piece, we have this really simple kind of 3-note motive, and I like doing little things like this where I take a 3-4 note motive and I try to stretch it out as much as I can and basically develop it as much. One of my composition teachers, Stephen Bryant, kind of taught me about the economy of material and about taking that material and just stretching it as much as possible. And it was something I never did before, and I've really tried to make that one of the emphasis now in my compositions, and we have that here. So we have our first motive here, which is this 3-note motive, and then we have this kind of call and answer thing going on, and you'll hear that throughout the entire piece. So at the end of that section, you guys heard the first major big trombone kind of gliss section there. My advice and tips for that is that they need to make sure they wait for that gliss to go all the way to the end of the measure. Wait till the beat 4, then start it. Likewise with measure 3 here, you want to wait for your until you start right at measure 3, and you want to make that gliss go out as long as possible, as slow as possible. And it'll work really well with electronics. So let's go ahead and listen through rehearsal A through rehearsal B. So before we get to the big happy section, I kind of want to go over a few things for that section here. This woodwind section here, I really wanted to start emphasizing this whole idea of we have left and right woodwinds, and they are sitting away from each other and on opposite sides. So I kind of wrote this kind of theme that kind of gets passed back and forth, and we're still in a hard 3-4. And while this is going on, we start introducing a really long version of that original 3-note motive, and it just helps to build the tension. So my tip for this section is make sure your woodwinds are really agreeing on their note lengths here and here, and make sure that your clarinets are really speaking out. They're the only ones that are kind of doing this rising note motive again, so they do need to be kind of prominent throughout the entire thing. Same goes for the horns here. The horns do have that 3-note motive once again, and this should be very chorale-like, and they should be shaping the phrase to match the dynamic levels as well. And now we get up to what is the first of many build-ups in this piece. This is letter C through letter D. Okay, so right at the end there, you heard one of the first really exposed electronic sections. So let's talk about this section a little bit. This is a pretty tricky section as there's a tempo here, and it's one of the things that when I was up at Purdue and at Ottawa University, this section tends to kind of drag a little bit, and that's just a tendency with having these rhythmic kind of notes with these really long, elegant phrases that are kind of building up beneath it. Because those longer notes are wanting to slow down the rhythmic accuracy of these shorter phrases. So from a conductor standpoint, really just get that tempo locked in your head and don't let it slide. That's the biggest tip I can get for you. The other thing is to make sure that you're really, what will help you is if you really are accenting down beat ones in your brass section here as well. So this leads up to rehearsal D, where we've kind of got our first kind of timpani effect using a timpani slur. Not all timpanis, depending on the make and model, can do a G to C slur, glissando like that. So my recommendation is if you do start on anything, do start on the G, but just try to gliss down as far as you can on the timpani without physically breaking it, and then immediately dampening it off. And don't worry, the electronics will cover it up really nicely while still having that effect. down here we can kind of start seeing our first real split percussion effect where we have a marimba on the right side of stage and we have a marimba on the left side of stage. So let's go ahead and listen to the next couple of rehearsal letters and I'll go through those. Okay. So in this section, we're setting in a lot of motivic development, and we've kind of got a couple different ideas going back and forth here. So the big main one is we have this kind of like, I wouldn't fully call it an ostinato pattern, but we do have this brand new lower wind run pattern that acts as this subtle underlying texture. So my advice for that is, while this is a very important idea, it should not be the main thing you focus on in rehearsals, because ultimately it is going to become like basically the base or the foundation that the rest of the stuff is going to stick out over. The main effects actually start here in, I believe this is measure 62, 63, where we have these woodwind lip bends. So you'll notice here, like the woodwinds are bent down, I think it's from a G to an F sharp. Yep. So if possible, woodwind players should be able to achieve this kind of glissando slur effect using lip bends. And to help reinforce that, I added some trombone slurs and glisses here as well. It helps really sell that out, and it adds this kind of like phasing, kind of shifting effect onto the piece. Same advice again, make sure your trombones and anybody who's doing that does not start their glissando until the very last beat of that measure. Most of the time with my music, if I, like, say for example on this C right here, if I started the glissando here and I notated there, that's where I want it to start. So just as a rule of thumb for my music, start wherever I start the glissando to be notated. Even if it's tied to a note, wait till that value and then start your glissando. So this thing kind of we use the lip bend to effectively pass this melody back and forth between the left and right side. And then we continuing developing that melody while we're also passing this kind of like low woodwind runs back and forth as well. And the same thing is also happening in the percussion. And it kind of builds with this big kind of like silencing moment. And we still have a big absence and large of all the electronics here, but we'll be building those back up again here shortly. So let's go ahead and listen through E all the way up until when the electronics kick in. I'll go ahead and just pause it right there for right now. So that section was very reminiscent of the other section. I do add this kind of driving hi-hat pattern. It's very important that that does be kind of present because it is the only rhythmic thing that is going on throughout this entire section. And so that will help you out with a lot of your tempo, with a lot of your dragging stuff, making sure you have a really strong presence of that cymbal in there. So we just got led up to rehearsal F, and F is the same kind of effect where we have these woodwind lip bends, and they're really exposed out in this section. So this would be something that I spend a little bit more rehearsal time on to make sure like they're all bending at the same time. My kind of advice for you is only have a couple players on each part kind of doing the bends while the rest of them do an effective slur. It'll help stabilize the note that they're targeting, that they're target bending towards. And it'll also make the sound a little bit more clear. So let me just go on here. And all while this is happening on, by the way, the glockenspiel part, I've kind of neglected to tell you this, but You will need a pretty strong player for this because this part becomes very important later on down the road. So let's go ahead and listen to F up to G just to win the electronic center. All right, and I'll go ahead and pause it right there, about 4 measures after G. So that is our first entrance of what I call my electric stutter beat bed thing. And this is kind of cool because I haven't been able to achieve something like this before, but I can now have my electronics be tempo synced to whatever the conductor's chosen tempo is. Excuse me. So the way that I was able to achieve this was Ableton Live has this ability to you can tap the tempo and map it to a button. And so during these first couple of measures, the first 8 beats, you can have your electronics player literally tap T in the keyboard, match your tempo, and the electronics will line up pretty well. There is kind of like a downside to that though, where it's like you're gonna have a very strong tendency to want to follow the tempo of the electronics. Electronics aren't perfectly in tempo. Or like they aren't really in sync with what the bass drum pattern is. The bass drum pattern is completely different than what the electronics are. So you as a conductor kind of have to just tune the electronics out and just really groove with your bass drums and just make sure that you're really like locking that tempo in with them. And the rest of this phrasing itself will kind of take care of itself. Especially when you start getting into sections like this where you kind of have a little bit more complicated wooden patterns. So, that was a big thing. Like one of the biggest critiques that I got was that part was really hard to kind of follow. And in the new version of electronics, I made that a little bit easier to follow out. So when this does get published, this will not be as big of a problem. If you do not have the ability to do bowed crotales, that's perfectly fine. Or if you don't have a good set of crotales, like you can substitute this out for another set of glockenspiel. Or you can also use these as a bowed vibraphone. That has pretty much the same residency and effect. Just as long as you can hear these through it, then it'll be fine. So let's go ahead and listen through this whole electronic section and brass chorale. Okay, so that was our first kind of big exposed electronic section with the brass chorale. So some tips about this. I would really just practice this section without any of the percussion, without any electronics, and just work on getting as warm and as rich of a sound as you possibly can with your brass. This will complement the electronics so nicely, but it's really hard to do it when they've got this really complicated kind of stuttery beat bed going on in their ears since they tend to sit in the back. So best rehearsal technique for that, rehearse this section, no woodwinds, no nothing, treat it like you're doing like a brass warm-up, and really follow those phrasing arcs, especially in the dynamics. Those are really important. They really help sell the message and really deliver that 3-note motive, because this is basically essentially just a 3-note motive really, really just stretched out in chorale form. Your trumpet player here, they kind of have to have a hero moment where they need to start as a mezzo forte on this high A or concert G. It is a scary part, but when done correctly, it sounds just as gorgeous as Purdue does it. And it's one of those moments where it comes together and it just sounds absolutely gorgeous. Um, Another thing to note is your bass drum players will be kind of alternating back and forth. They also kind of have the same kind of phrase markings as well. So make sure like the whole group at this time is kind of doing the same thing with like shaping the phrases. Another pro tip for the electronics. One thing that we did notice was, and I did fix this in the version, there is kind of this bug when you let off the electronics when you stop playing them, where it kind of does this weird stutter. We noticed that I think the day of the performance, and we ended up having the electronics player actually let off on measure 160. So you can, even with the new version of electronics, you can let off on electronics on 160, and electronics will basically just fade out and blend in with this, so it doesn't necessarily like stick out like a sore thumb that there's kind of a little stutter at the end. I'm still investigating on why that happened, but who knows. So at letter J, we're going back into another woodwind lip bend section. So let's listen to this all the way up to one of the first big moments of the piece. All right, now I'm gonna stop it right there before the climax at K. So the only thing that to note to really point on here is your euphonium tubas have the motive of the whole piece. So make sure that they are brought out a little bit more, even though they're at mezzo piano. I would realistically have them play almost like mezzo piano, mezzo forte plus kind of just so they can kind of stick above the woodwind texture. Otherwise, they will get buried. Excuse me one moment. So. For this bass drum gong roll, I do want hard mallets, not wood. I did test this with the wood ones, and they're too articulatey for me. So if you've got a good set of strong hard mallets, they'll be just great enough, but just as long as they're not solid wood. So yeah, let's go into the next section of K. Okay, so this is one of the first really truly huge big moments of the piece, and it's leading us up to the finale. So a couple things to note in here. Your trombones have the strong melody, so they're in this unison octave. So really just let them do their thing. Make sure like these glissando, especially like right here and here, they're just as dirty as possible, and they come in as late as like they gliss as late as possible. I didn't put slurs over these notes because I just assumed with the glissando that they would just naturally just slur from each note. So lots of breath control here. Don't be afraid to have them drop out a little bit early here to take sneak in breaths. This is also one of the sections where I kind of had this whole thing planned where I wanted a huge, massive horn moment because the Purdue horns in the recording of Spark made my jaw hit the floor. So I wanted another just absolutely epic, like Mahler would be proud moment in the piece. So I kind of wrote this section here with that in mind. And let me tell you, the first time I went into rehearsal and I got to hear that in person in the rehearsal room, I could not stop smiling the entire time. It was a fantastic moment, and the recording does not do justice just how strong their horn section is. It's ridiculous, guys. So, while this is all happening out, you have lots of these little ostinato patterns are kind of going on through like the trumpets, while the woodwinds are kind of like in the background doing the secondary motive of the whole piece. They're not as important here, but they can slow you down if you're not careful with monitoring your tempo. It is in 12/8 plus 2/4, so you can find that groove, and once you get that groove going, it should fall together pretty nicely. Trumpets also need to make sure like they are really matching their articulations and the length of their notes. That will help with the tempo a lot too. All while this is happening, you have this kind of glockenspiel ostinato pattern that's kind of going on the bottom. Once again, not as important as long as they're hitting the right notes and they're kind of keeping tempo. That's fine. It's not really meant to be played out, but it's just there to provide something, another texture on the bottom, along with your cymbal player. So at this section, I kind of like writing these little notes in here for my trumpet players. The commissioning group's trumpet players were really, really good, and so I wanted to write, once again, another hero moment for the trumpets, where they could, basically, if they wanted to show off their chops, they can realistically take that up an octave and play all the way up to a high D and hold that out right there in the first and second trumpets. I believe in the, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the Premiere recording, both the first and the second trumpet hit that D and just absolutely nailed it. And then we're kind of going into a similar section as before at the beginning of the piece, where you have this kind of 3-4-5 note repeated pattern. But I kind of do this little trick where it's like I really want to get us into 4/4 for the kind of the finale of the piece, and so I just straight up switch it to 4/4. And when you think there's going to be another phrase of that 3/4, I hit you up with a full 4/4 measure, leading up into measure 208 and rehearsal L. So let's go ahead and just listen from L up to the ending of the piece, and I might replay a few sections there. Okay, and so that's the ending of the piece. So let's kind of scroll back up here a few pages so I can give a couple suggestions for you and your future performances. So this section is, once again, it's a 3-note motive of the whole piece, but I just chose to make it this kind of like fake halftimey feel. So while this is all happening, I brought back both the stutter bed and the played electronic MIDI keyboard. So once again, ignore the electronics. They're not going to be completely accurate to your tempo, and you're going to want to try to follow them. Just ignore them. All while this is happening, you have this ostinato pattern of the glockenspiel and crotales on the bottom. So my big tips for you is anytime you have any kind of low wind, whether that be the tubas, the tenor saxes, bass clarinets, bassoons, coming in with these emphasized like half notes, really punch those accents. Same with the bass drum, just really have them punch those accents. It's kind of a call and answer. You have the 3-note motive, and then you have these low Ds that kind of answer that call. And it kind of makes this really punchy effect, and it's really, really cool. And the way that produced it is perfect. And of course, around this measure here, this is 219 to 221. Your oboes, alto saxes, make sure like they really shine out, because once again, they're bringing out that main motive. We pretty much have the same thing for the rest of the piece. Follow the glissandi pretty well. Now, my big tip for like this last measure here is do not let the energy kind of die. So like at this point, like the group is pretty much like they'll be near on E as terms of gas goes. So really make sure like they've got enough fuel in the tank left over to kind of save, to keep both of these measures really big and huge, so that when we arrive to measure 231, the forte piano is just that more effective, because we're coming from a very loud place, re-emphasizing it, and that'll allow the horns to kind of stick out here one more time for their one more epic horn moment, leading up to rehearsal M, where we have the final statement of this motive in the woodwinds. and followed by one last grand band unison of the motive with electronics. So originally, when I wrote this, I did not have this little forte crescendo thing written here. It just stood out as fortissimo for the end of the piece, and actually had the electronics trailing off. At Dr. Sweet's suggestion, we axed 3 measures out of the piece, and we just had the everybody crescendo out for the final note. Liked a heck of a lot better, and so we stuck with it. So the big thing here is just make sure your horns can rip, your euphoniums can also rip as well, and that everybody's got enough gas on the tank to everybody to play at fortissimo for these 3 notes. That's all they gotta do, and that's all they gotta say I have to have. So, I think that's everything that I pretty much have for this piece. It took me about 3 or 4 months to write it, I think, all in all. I was also writing another piece at the same time. And then, because I remember very vaguely, I wanted to get this done before marching band season, drill writing season started in May. So, I can't think of anything else to really tell you much more about this piece. If you have any comments about it, any questions, feel free to DM me about it. Or if there's anything else that's really confusing about this piece at all, I'm going to be putting up a big Google document with this piece that kind of has all my notes with annotations to rehearsal letters. So yeah, I appreciate everybody who turned in for this first one. I'll be posting this up soon. And I think for the next one, I will be doing Current in the Sky. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you all have a good day.